It was just over 1,200 years ago, on December 25th, that a ruler was crowned. I said 1,200. On December 25th, it was in the year 800, again about 12 centuries ago, an event occurred, and the effects of which have reverberated throughout history, throughout Western civilization, and really even have some effect to this very day. On that day at St. Peter's Basilica in the city of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, Leo III, presided over the worship service. Present at that service was a man named Charles. Charlemagne is probably how you better know him, the name in which he's remembered in history, which means Charles the Great. And during the service, the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope as that office began to be called, he took a glorious crown, one of the most beautiful that you can imagine, gold and encrusted with gems, and he went and he placed it, from what history tells us, surprisingly, on the head of Charlemagne. The Pope coronated Charlemagne, declaring him emperor of a new Holy Roman Empire. With this coronation, the Pope claimed the existence of something that had actually not existed for hundreds of years. That is, a Roman Empire in Western Europe. With this coronation, they also, and this is more interesting, undermined a very powerful emperor in Byzantine, far off in the east, that still considered himself ruler of what had been the Roman Empire. With this coronation, a Frankish king, that really means a Germanic king, he was not Roman, he would reestablish authority over much of Western Europe. And with this coronation, and this is probably the most significant historically, the Pope would bolster his growing claims of supremacy. Right? Not only did he now have the right to be able to say that he had authority over the Catholic Church, the ecclesial or the spiritual world, but now even crowning a king, an emperor? I mean, wouldn't that also imply that he had the power to dethrone a ruler if he so wanted? Very powerful claims. And this was going to be an ongoing battle throughout the Middle Ages between the church and state, battling for supremacy on the continent. But Charlemagne's rule, this one now crowned by Leo III, it represented what was the brightest light, really, of what we know as the Dark Ages. You ever heard of that time? Not so bright. But this was a bright time in terms of culture and social order, education, and even religion. And the vastness of the empire was impressive. Again, much of Western Europe under his domain. And yet, we don't remember the crowning of Charlemagne. Unless you're really interested in histories, particularly medieval history, you've probably never even heard of this. Or if you have, it sounds only vaguely familiar from maybe if you took a course in Western Civ in college. What occurred on December 25th in the year 800 was one of the most important events of early medieval history. But it was as if nothing in comparison to another ruler that the church has remembered on the very date that Charlemagne was coronated. Charlemagne was present at St. Peter's precisely because it was Christmas. It was December 25th. That's why he had traveled a long distance. It was a significant holiday for Christians. For many centuries, Christians have set aside December 25th as a holiday to remember to celebrate the birth of Jesus. But the fact is, we actually don't know when Jesus was born. He might have been born in December. We like to think that he might have been, but it might have been November or March or August. We just simply don't know. But Christians began reserving one special day every year as a time of remembrance for Christ's birth, and thus the Christmas holiday. That which occurred 2,000 years ago in a small little town in Judah, it was of eternally greater consequence than what happened 800 years later in the great city of Rome. But what a contrast do we see in the scene. Try to picture it with me for a moment. A stunning basilica. You can still go there today. Anyone ever been to Rome? You can still go. Stunning basilica there. In this great, ancient, historical, imperial city versus virtually a barnyard in tiny Bethlehem. What a contrast. In Bethlehem, there was no pomp. There was no pageantry. Wasn't even a crown. And yet the ruler who was born to Mary was unlike any ruler who would ever walk the earth, before or since. I've titled my message, From Ancient Glory to Lowly Bethlehem. Our text is Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Just one verse. It's one of the last books in the Old Testament. Turn there with me, please. The prophet Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. And as you're turning there, what we're going to see is that Micah prophesied that God would call a Redeemer of ancient glory from the town of Bethlehem. Would you read it with me? Micah 5:2. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be a ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. When I was probably 9 or 10 years old, I was in a Christmas play. I think back, and it seems to be a thing in sort of late 80s, early to mid 90s. A lot of churches put on plays. I was in one of those. I only had one line. It was the height of my acting career. The idea in the play, and I don't even remember what the whole play was about, but there was sort of a town square set up, and there's a man walking around with a microphone. I think he's supposed to be something like a reporter. And he's asking people questions. He's saying, what do you think is the meaning of Christmas? And what about you, ma'am? What do you think is the meaning of Christmas? And so on. And so it came around to my part, and I was so proud, and I was so ready. And my line, he says, now, what about you, young man? What do you think is the meaning of Christmas? And I said, I think it's Santa Claus's birthday. And then, the church chuckles and everything. And then they go on, okay, what about you? And so on and so forth. And again, that was the height of my acting career. I want to bring that question to you, though, just as we even begin. What does Christmas mean to you? I'm thinking specifically, now on one hand, this is a question for all of us that we want to ponder, but specifically for those in there, I see many people who are visiting who are not normally with us, hopefully invited by a friend or family member. We're so glad that you are here. You are honored guests. But I especially want to ask you, what does Christmas mean to you? This single verse in the book of Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, written hundreds of years before the New Testament, it contains a message. This little tiny verse contains a message that is exceedingly greater than anything that a merely cultural holiday can offer you. These 17 words in this little letter, 17 words in the original language at least, they proclaim something infinitely more worthy of celebration. Up to this point in the book of Micah, again, there's 4 chapters preceding, and we're not going to go back and read all of those, but up to this point, God has been warning Israel of judgment. In the book of Jeremiah, roughly contemporary with Micah, the prophet Micah is called a prophet of doom. His pronouncements of judgment were well known. But as we see repeatedly in the Old Testament, and truly throughout all of the Scriptures, God's warning of judgment is so often followed by hope of redemption. The very first word in the text there is a conjunction. But, he says in verse 2, having said everything else, all the way leading up here, all the way through chapter 4, and even chapter 5, verse 1, having said all of that, he says, but, or really now, or listen, he says. It's meant to catch our attention. It reverses the whole flow of the book from one of present defeat to one of hope. Micah said, things are really hard now, and you all are really into it. This is a big mess, yes, but a Messiah is coming. The Redeemer is coming. The kings born and set up in Jerusalem, which is again the great city of the empire of ancient Israel, those kings and their great palace and all of the grandeur that represented a monarchy in the ancient world, they had all failed. And they were failing. But the ruler to be born in lowly Bethlehem will triumph. The Christmas story is a story of hope. The prophet Micah points to Bethlehem here just in the very beginning of verse 2. Bethlehem was a small town in the larger region of Judah. Judah was a large area that was originally granted to one of Jacob's sons. Remember the 12 tribes of Israel basically allotting all of the different parts of Israel to these sons of Jacob or Israel. And so thus Judah was one of the sons. And then from the outside, as we think about it though, what Bethlehem represented to those in the ancient world, Bethlehem was anything but impressive. It was small, it was humble, And it really just resided in the shadow of much larger and more powerful Jerusalem, which really was not all that far off. When Israel's prophets begin speaking of God's coming redemption, Bethlehem is not really the kind of place that you would expect it to come from. Bethlehem? Bethlehem seemed insignificant. Well, why or how could this little insignificant town, how could it have anything to do with God's great redemption? Surely it'll come from the mountains. Surely it'll come from the great city of Jerusalem. For those of you who have lived in the Bay Area your whole life, this might actually be hard for you to grasp. If city life is all you know, if you've lived here your whole life in this massive, sprawling metropolis, 7.5 million people in the Bay Area, it's difficult for maybe you to conceive of kind of the point, but let me lean into this a little bit. Not that much has changed in the last few millennia. Cities are places of influence. They're places of status, wealth, power, resources. Even in modern America, those who grow up in small towns or in more rural areas, they grow up often with kind of a mixture of awe of big cities, but also a mixture of fear. And honestly, many struggle with inferiority complex just of their own smallness. The media doesn't represent them much, and even entertainment and so on. There's just this weirdness and this awe but fear of cities. That was Bethlehem. No one went out of their way to go to Bethlehem. And Bethlehem's smallness didn't only refer to its size. It didn't just refer to its population. It also referred to its perceived quality. I mean, think of it this way. Bethlehem was like the last kid to be picked for the sports team. He was short and skinny, and sadly, neither team really kind of thought he would contribute that much. The team is kind of, okay, you can have so-and-so over there. That was Bethlehem. But don't you love a good underdog story? In the early portions of the Old Testament, Bethlehem is often overlooked. When it is mentioned, it's sometimes mentioned even with derision. But Micah declares, what does he declare there in the text? You, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too small to be among the clans of Judah, to you will be an untold honor. The background of this honor is actually seen in this strange word, Ephrathah. Ephrathah. Hey kids, try spelling that without looking. Ephrathah. You might start praying right now that this word doesn't show up on one of your vocabulary quizzes at school, kids. It's a weird word. In fact, even just this week at our missional community, and for those of you who don't know, we have several missional communities that meet throughout the city, throughout the area for times of fellowship and so on during the week. And we were reading several of these Old Testament passages that are pointing to the Christmas story in the Old Testament. And we were reading Micah 5:2, and the person who was reading it got to the point and he said, "What's this word? How do you say that?" It's a weird word. The word is merely, it's a district in Judah, so it's almost like a county, if you could kind of think of it that way, and it's where Bethlehem was located. But despite the smallness of the region, it did have one special honors that Jews did recognize. Just one. This was the place where David was born. This was the place from where David was descended. David, the great king of Israel's past glories, and the one to whom God had promised in 2 Samuel chapter 7, that a ruler from this line would reign forever on the throne. That is an honor that all Jews did recognize. And so now, you see, we're getting somewhere. But still, even recognizing that, for a moment, God's deliverance would seem very surprising that it would come from Bethlehem. The point is this: God uses the small and the weak things of this world to accomplish His mighty purposes. God did not, nor has He ever, nor will He ever follow the expectations of this world. That is part of the beauty of the biblical story. That God specifically and precisely does not follow the ways of the world. What the world calls great, what the world calls mighty, what the world calls impressive. God is not captivated by these things. When we remember the background of the Christmas story, so much of it reinforces this very point. Have you ever considered that? I mean, just think of Jesus' family. Joseph and Mary were anything but rich and powerful. At best, they would have been working class folk. They were not necessarily poor, but they were anything but powerful. Think of the setting of his birth. He was born far away from any grand palace that you would expect for a king. Again, he was born virtually in a barnyard. Couldn't even find a hotel. And his infancy was anything but peaceful that you would expect of a king, surrounded by security and peace. The Prince of Peace, he came into a very violent world. I mean, violence is one of the first things that they had to face. You know the story. One of the first things that his parents have to do is flee to Egypt. They have to flee the jealous wrath of King Herod. This was anything but a peaceful place. Not all that much has changed in the world. And yet, from this helpless child would come the most mighty source of deliverance that the world would ever see. 1 Corinthians 1:27 brings to bear this very point. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. This is the beautiful paradox of Christianity. God has never followed the expectations of this world. Jesus was born the son of David, that is the descendant of David. But you remember even David's situation while we kind of continue pondering this? David was the least among his brothers. He was the youngest. And now in our culture, we're so egalitarian in our mind, we miss really the weight of this. We want to say, oh, it doesn't matter how many siblings you have, everyone is equal. That was not the culture in the ancient world. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that was not the culture. In this culture, the youngest brother was really good for nothing except being coddled by mom and dad. That was really about it. He was the baby of the family. And so he was their child of old age often and so on. We even see that, for instance, with Abraham. But God intentionally chose David at the expense of his older brothers and in their presence. Think there were any mixed feelings about that from his brothers? I'm the oldest here. Why is that? Because God uses the small and weak things of this world to accomplish mighty purposes. Kids, do you hear that? Mighty purposes come from small places. David wasn't just the younger brother. Remember what he did for a job? He was a shepherd. Now in Christianity we talk so much about shepherding that we forget how lowly of a job this was at the time. Again, it was appropriate for the younger brother. Yeah, go out and tend the sheep, David. It was anything but impressive. And yet he became the greatest king of Israel's history. His descendant to be born in Bethlehem would follow a similar path, the one that we're recognizing today, and yet so greatly surpass his ancestor. By the time Micah reported this prophecy, King David had been dead for generations, somewhere around 3 centuries. Long time. But regardless of all subsequent kings of Israel, they looked to David as the greatest king. He was the one that they would all want to emulate. He was the marble model. He was something like an ancient Messiah figure to him. That is, one who was anointed specifically of God. The prophets proclaimed that one like David, really here, one from David, would return. This ruler would bring redemption for God's people. You know, Micah was not the only prophet to recognize this. He was not the only prophet to comfort God's people with a promise related to David. Other prophets did, Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and so on. And according to God's perfect providence, the Lord came to be born in the little town of Bethlehem. How can we look past God's providence so strongly at work here? He brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. I mean, you know the story. Bethlehem was not their home. They didn't live there. They lived quite a ways off in Galilee, really the opposite side of the country. It would be like moving from the west coast to the east coast, opposite side of Israel. In another town, Nazareth, another small town. But the region of Judah was Joseph's ancestral home. And so on account of a census given by the Roman ruler, this distant land, Joseph and his young wife, although she was pregnant, they had to travel down to Bethlehem for the census. Next week, my family and I will be going on vacation We're looking forward to it. We're going to be going to Missouri to visit family. And let me tell you, I'm not from Missouri. I wasn't born there. I wasn't raised there. You know that San Jose is my hometown. But I do have very deep roots there. My mother's side of the family, it's something like an ancestral home, if you can get that. But it's not home for me. It's not. I'm not from there. But for some reason, because of those roots, there's some little part of it that feels a little like home when I go. Joseph going back to Bethlehem was something like that. It was not his hometown, but no doubt occasionally in his life he had gone there, and this is one of those times. It just so happens that Mary would deliver her baby there. It just so happens at that moment, all the things collided as they did. Think of them. Caesar's decree, her term in pregnancy, the lineage of Joseph. By the way, Mary was also descended from David, so she's also there, has roots there. No, this didn't just happen. This was by God's perfect design. Why did Caesar at that exact moment decide to have the census? Why not a month earlier? Why not 6 months later? This was actually unusual for a Roman ruler to do this anyway. Very rare in history. What are the chances that this woman from Galilee would have her baby in the Judean town of Bethlehem, so many miles away? I love the way that Charles Spurgeon says it. He says, it was Caesar's whim, but it was God's decree. This was God's good design and fulfillment of Micah's prophecy and other prophecies in the Old Testament. I want you to hear this. However unlikely things appear from our own finite, our own little perspective, however unlikely they might seem to us, God always fulfills His promises. And they always exceed our expectations. That's the story of Christmas. Now, looking back to the text, notice who does the sending there, and kind of right in the middle of the verse. Really, who does the sending, or for whom the sending is performed? He says, for you, or from you, shall come forth for me. That's God speaking. This is by God's design, His good design. You know, this really adds a deeper layer of significance to the whole Christmas story. The sending of God's Son, the incarnation of Jesus, was all according to God's good plan. The society that we live in is a very disenchanted place. It really is. Again, especially specifically here in our own little sub-region. We're taught to see the world, although this is rarely said outwardly, we're taught to see the world kind of as an endless natural process, almost like the world is a natural machine. When stuff happens, it just happens. There's no meaning, good, bad, or ugly. It just happens. Again, life is just a big material machine. Kids, listen up, kids. Few people will say it plainly, but that's basically how many people in our society view the world. What a cold and depressing worldview. This is not at all the worldview of Christianity. We live in a very enchanted world, if I can say that. And that's not the most accurate, but let me make my point. Here in verse 2, the Bible declared that God will send a ruler. And God is not uninvolved in this world. That is the story of the Bible. God promised that He would send a ruler. Not merely a teacher, not merely a politician, but a righteous ruler. And think of His pedigree. His pedigree in the line of David implies that He will be a great ruler. But there's much more to be said about His background than that. And that's where we're heading now. Micah said, look there back at the verse, really the last part there. Micah said, His coming forth is of old. Now, there's a lot for us to ponder here. At Christmas, we celebrate the birth of Jesus. But the one born in Bethlehem existed long before that moment. This was no ordinary baby. This was no ordinary moment in history. This little child was no stranger to the earth. He had a new form. He took on humanity to be like us, even as we sang about just a moment ago. But He knew this world very well. The book of John, chapter 1, verse 3 tells us that all things were created through Him. Even before the world began, he lived. You know the Christmas hymn. In fact, we just sang it. Hark the herald angels sing. That line, veiled in flesh the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with men to dwell. Jesus our Emmanuel. Micah said that the ruler will come. He will have origins that are in ancient times or in days of old. This is really a fascinating statement for us to ponder. Again, David had lived quite a while, 2.5 centuries or so earlier than Micah. But this one, about whom he writes, is from ancient days that were long before David. His origins were from eternity. He is everlasting. The baby who was born in Bethlehem began to live in this world as he did. He began to live among us, but he did not begin there. He comes from eternity. You can ponder this for the rest of your life. You know that? You can meditate on this, and you will never even begin to reach the depths of the glory of it. When we meditate on it with a right heart, it is a beautiful act of worship that God is eternal, and yet he was born to earth. By the way, this ruler's glory is not only in the ancient past. Micah prophesies, if you just look down a couple verses in verse 4, he says, "And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God." Great days are still ahead. This was only the beginning. Church, when we think about the Christmas holiday, remember that the greatest victory was still to come. The event that we remember during the Christmas season represented the hope of God's people. You realize Israel had been plagued for so long by their own failures. They were sinking ever deeper in debt because of their sins. They had so long been oppressed by enemies on every side, militarily and politically. Right now, and when we think about the birth of Jesus, even under the heavy hand of the Romans. Through this ruler would come deliverance. And this ruler would come from Bethlehem, of all places. He would come and he would faithfully care for God's flock. This ruler still today is our hope and our salvation. The Christmas story is a story of hope. The Christmas story is a story of salvation. As we read the New Testament, honestly, even just casually, we see how these verses find their fulfillment in the coming of Jesus Christ being born. The Gospels of Matthew and of John directly apply Micah 5:2 to Jesus' birth. We see in Matthew 2 and in Luke 2 that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. He is the one whose origins are from of old and of ancient times, but as Romans 1:3 says, he is also the son of David. And as Ephesians 2:14 says, he is our peace. From eternal glory, Jesus was born a king in the humble town of Bethlehem. You know, at the end of the book of Micah, just a couple pages over in chapter 7, it's such a short book. At the end of Micah, he makes a concluding declaration about God's grace. In this statement, we see the very basis upon which God sent his Son, who took on flesh and who we celebrate today. I want to read it, the very last 3 verses of Micah. Micah 7, beginning in verse 18. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever. Because he delights in steadfast love, he will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. The Christmas story is a story about grace. It's the true story about how God came to earth, born of a woman, destined to give his life as a ransom for our sake. It was by grace that he came. It was by grace that he fulfilled his ministry on earth. And it was by grace that he fulfilled his mission by going to the cross. And this is our great hope. The benefits of Christ's work stand available to you if only you will believe. If only you will repent of your sins. If only you will follow after him. He will welcome you into his kingdom. That is the story of Christmas. Let's pray.